The air hangs thick and cold in the emerald embrace of the Pacific Northwest. Mist coils like spectral serpents between ancient Douglas firs, their branches heavy with damp moss that glows unnervingly green in the weak autumnal light filtering through the canopy. The usual chorus of the forest, the chatter of squirrels, the distant woodpecker, is muted, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the drip of condensation. Temperature 7 degrees Celsius, a chill that seeps into your bones. Winston Hall moves through this silence like a shadow. 45, lean and weathered, his face is a map of time spent under open sky, deep lines etched by wind and rain, eyes the sharp, observant gray of granite, missing nothing. He wears a heavy, faded dark green canvas jacket, its cuffs worn, thick woolen beanie pulled low against the damp chill, and mud-caked waterproof boots that sink silently into the carpet of decaying leaves and moss. His posture is usually that of relaxed vigilance, but today it's coiled. He's tracking a trail, not of game, but of fresh, dark crimson blood, stark against the pale brown leaves and vibrant green moss. It's a trail that shouldn't be here, deep in these isolated woods of Washington state. What animal is hurt this badly? Winston crouches, examining the drops. They're large, too large for a deer, too fresh for anything natural, a cougar maybe. But the scent is wrong, metallic, sharp, carrying an unfamiliar, musky undertone. His gut tightens. This isn't right. He follows the trail deeper, the mist thickening, the silence becoming heavier, more watchful. Every rustle in the undergrowth makes his hand instinctively reach for the sturdy walking stick hooked to his belt. He's not expecting the impossible. Pushing aside a heavy curtain of hanging, dripping moss, Winston stops dead. There, lying on the lush, moss-covered forest floor, is a massive African lioness. She is a striking, impossible contrast to the emerald and brown world around her, her short, golden-tan coat glowing almost unnaturally bright. Her belly is heavily swollen, resting ponderously on the damp earth, unmistakable proof of imminent motherhood. But it's the 3 deep, vertical, bright red lacerations marring her flank that freeze Winston's blood. They look vicious, fresh, agonizing. Her head rests wearily on her front paws. Her dark-rimmed eyes, heavy-lidded with exhaustion and pain, fix on him. She issues a low, guttural, weak, desperate chuff, a sound of pure, primal need. In the ancient, mist-shrouded heart of the American wilderness, she is utterly, terrifyingly out of place, dying, begging. Winston's breath catches. Decades of wildlife knowledge scream impossible. A lioness here, this far north, and pregnant, bleeding. His trained eyes instantly assess. She doesn't have hours, maybe not even one. The sight of her, so vulnerable, so powerful, yet so close to death, strikes a chord deep within him. The quiet life he's carved out here, escaping the mess of the world, shatters in that moment. There is no walking away. The forest holds its breath. The race against time has begun. Winston's story, the lioness's fight, and the shocking twist that follows, it's all happening right now in the heart of the untamed Pacific Northwest. But this isn't just fiction. Every day, incredible animals face impossible odds, fighting for survival against poachers, habitat loss, and the unpredictable forces of nature. They need voices. They need defenders. You can be part of the solution. Subscribe to Wildward Bound right now. By subscribing, you're not just getting access to the most thrilling, edge-of-your-seat wildlife survival stories told with stunning visuals and heart-pounding narration. You're joining a community dedicated to raising awareness and supporting real wildlife conservation efforts. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single episode. The story of Winston, the lioness, and the hunters who thought they were the apex predators. Myth's just getting started. You won't believe the twist that unfolds when the true king of the forest steps out of the shadows. Comment below, "I stand with Winston," and tell us what you think will happen next. Your subscription gives these stories the reach they deserve. Your voice matters. Be there until the very end. You won't want to miss what follows. Subscribe to Wildward Bound, where every story fights for the wild. Winston moved quickly but with deliberate calm, his mind racing through the immediate priorities. Stabilize, transport, shelter. The lioness's labored breathing was shallow, her eyes fluttering. The deep claw marks on her flank were weeping dark blood, attracting flies that buzzed insistently in the cold air. He couldn't treat her here. She needed warmth, shelter, and he needed to get her out before she went into shock or those wounds worsened. He scanned the immediate area. Thick, fallen branches lay scattered near the base of an ancient cedar. He selected 2 sturdy, straight ones, each about 6 feet long. Using his hunting knife, he quickly stripped the smaller branches and twigs, smoothing the ends. He found 2 shorter, forked branches to serve as handles. Stretcher. It was crude, but it would have to do. Approaching the lioness, he moved slowly, speaking in low, soothing murmurs. "Easy now, girl, easy. I'm here to help." Her ears twitched, her eyes fixing on him with a mixture of pain and wariness. She was too weak to resist, but the instinct to protect herself was still there. Winston kept his movements predictable, avoiding direct eye contact that might be seen as a challenge. He slid one branch carefully beneath her shoulders and neck, wincing as she let out a low groan. The second branch went under her hips, just above her swollen belly. He worked with agonizing slowness, ensuring he didn't jostle her too much. Finally, with the lioness settled as comfortably as possible on the makeshift stretcher, Winston positioned himself at one end. He'd need leverage. His eyes darted to his parked ATV 20 yards back along the trail he'd followed. Could he manage it? The terrain was rough but mostly clear of large obstacles. He couldn't drag her, it would be too slow and jarring. The ATV was his only option. He started pulling, the rough bark digging into his palms, the weight immense. The stretcher bumped over roots and rocks. The lioness whimpered, her breathing becoming more labored. Sweat beaded on Winston's forehead despite the chill, mixing with the mud. Every few yards he paused, checking her pulse, her breathing, wiping his brow. Come on, just a little further. Reaching the ATV, he quickly secured the stretcher to the rear cargo rack using thick rope he always carried. He modified the rack years ago for hauling firewood and supplies it would hold. With immense care, he drove the ATV slowly, painfully slowly, back along the trail towards his cabin. The journey felt endless. Every bump, every dip in the trail sent a jolt through the stretcher. Winston cursed the uneven ground, urging the machine to go smoother, faster, but knowing speed was the enemy of stability. Finally, the familiar silhouette of his off-grid, single-story log cabin emerged through the mist, nestled against a backdrop of towering firs. His barn, a sturdy structure built from reclaimed timber, stood 20 yards to the side. It was larger, more sheltered, and had the space he needed. He parked the ATV near the barn door, his heart pounding with a mixture of exertion and dread. The real work was just beginning. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay, old wood, and engine oil. Winston lowered the stretcher gently onto a thick bed of clean straw he'd hastily prepared in a clear corner, away from his tools and equipment. The lioness lay exhausted, her sides heaving. Her golden coat was matted with blood and mud around the wounds in her belly. The 3 claw marks were truly terrifying. They ran vertically down her flank, deep enough to expose muscle and fascia in places. They weren't clean cuts. They were ragged, torn, indicative of immense force. Grisly, Winston's mind supplied, though he couldn't be sure. Whatever had inflicted them was massive and powerful. Infection was a serious risk. He needed to clean and dress them, but first he needed to assess her overall condition. Her pulse was thready and fast under the thin skin of her thigh. Her gums were pale. Shock. Blood loss. He quickly mixed a warm solution of clean water and a mild antiseptic soap he kept for treating wildlife. Using a soft cloth, he began gently cleaning around the wounds, carefully avoiding the raw tissue. He poured hydrogen peroxide directly into the deepest gash, causing the lioness to flinch and let out a low growl, but she remained still, her eyes watching him with weary trust. As he worked, meticulously cleaning each wound, a new concern arose. Her belly, already swollen, seemed to tighten further. She shifted restlessly, letting out a low, guttural moan that was different from her earlier cries of pain. Winston froze, his hand hovering above her. Contractions. "Oh no," he whispered. "Not now, not like this." He'd assisted in animal births before: deer, raccoons, a fox once, but never a big cat, never a lion, and never one in such critical condition. The stress of labor could push her over the edge. He needed to keep her calm, keep her heart rate as steady as possible. He kept talking to her, his voice a low, constant murmur. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe. Just breathe. Focus on breathing." He continued cleaning the wounds, his movements efficient but gentle, all the while monitoring her breathing and the tightening of her abdomen. He prepared clean towels, warm water, and a bucket. His own heart hammered against his ribs. The first cub came quickly, slick and tiny, wrapped in the amniotic sac. Winston was ready. He carefully tore the sac open, clearing the newborn's airway. A small, indignant squeak filled the barn as the cub took its first breath. Winston gently rubbed the tiny body with a clean towel, stimulating circulation and drying it, before placing it against the lioness's belly, near a nipple. The lioness, despite her weakness, instinctively nuzzled the cub, licking it clumsily. Minutes later, the second cub arrived, smaller but just as vigorous. Winston repeated the process, his hands steady now despite the adrenaline. 2 healthy cubs, each the size of a large house cat, squirming and mewing. The lioness, utterly spent, rested her head on the straw, her eyes half closed, but a flicker of fierce protectiveness ignited in her gaze as she looked at her newborns. She nudged them towards her, emitting a soft, rumbling purr that vibrated through the barn. Winston sagged against the barn wall, wiping sweat from his face. The immediate crisis of birth was over, but the lioness was still critical. She needed rest, warmth, and constant monitoring. He covered her and the cubs with a thick, clean blanket, then hurried to stoke the wood stove in the corner of the barn, filling the space with much-needed warmth. As the lioness dozed fitfully, the cubs nursing contentedly, Winston took the opportunity to clean her more thoroughly. He needed to check for other injuries, remove the mud and blood caked in her fur, especially around her neck and shoulders. He used warm water and a soft sponge, working carefully to avoid disturbing her. As he worked near her head, his fingers brushed against the thick ruff of fur behind her ear. Something felt unnatural, a small, hard lump, embedded just beneath the skin. Winston's brow furrowed. He carefully parted the fur, and there, nestled against the skin, was a small, dark object about the size of his thumbnail. It wasn't natural. Using the tip of his hunting knife, he carefully teased the object out. It was a small, high-tech tracking microchip, sleek, black, and utterly out of place in the wild. Winston's blood ran cold. Poachers, traffickers, this wasn't an accident. She'd been tagged, someone was tracking her, someone who shouldn't be here. His mind raced. Who knew she was here? How long had the chip been transmitting? He held the tiny device in his palm. It felt alien, sinister. He didn't have the tools to disable it properly, but he didn't need to. With a swift, decisive motion, he brought the heel of his boot down hard on the chip, crushing it into several small pieces. He scattered the fragments in the wood stove, the embers consuming them instantly. But it was too late. The damage was done. If the chip had been active, and it almost certainly had been, it would have been sending out a signal that would lead whoever owned it straight to his door. They would already know her location, his location. The mist outside seemed to thicken, the silence of the forest now feeling less like peace and more like a gathering storm. He was no longer just a man helping an injured animal. He was a target. The oppressive silence of the forest was shattered hours later, well after dusk had fallen, by a sound that didn't belong, the low, powerful rumble of engines. Winston, who had been dozing fitfully in a chair near the barn door, jolted awake. He peered out through a crack in the barn door. Headlights, 2 sets cutting swathes through the mist, approaching along the rough track leading to his property. Not the sound of a single vehicle, but multiple, black, sleek, and utterly out of place among the weathered logs and mud of his homestead. He moved quickly, quietly. He checked the lioness. She was resting, the cubs tucked safely beneath her, but her head was up, ears swiveling towards the new sounds, her body tense. She senses it too. Winston whispered, "SHHH, stay down, be quiet." He didn't know if she understood but she seemed to sense his urgency, settling lower, shielding the cubs. Winston ducked into the cabin, moving to the large window overlooking the approach. He peered out, his heart sinking. 2 black SUVs had pulled up at the edge of his clearing, their headlights blazing. Doors slammed. Heavily armed men emerged, stepping into the mist like ghosts from another world. They wore expensive, high-tech tactical rain gear, dark, water-resistant, with reinforced plates. Their faces were hard, set in expressions of cold efficiency and arrogance. They carried high-powered rifles, not hunting rifles but military-grade with expensive scopes and slings. They moved with a swagger that spoke of ownership, of entitlement. Leading them was a man who radiated ruthless authority. Taller than the others, with a sharp, angular face and cold, pale eyes that scanned the surroundings with predatory disdain. He wore a dark, water-resistant jacket over tactical pants and carried a large-caliber rifle loosely, like a farmer carries a hoe. This was no mere hunter, this was a trophy hunter, a ringleader. His gaze swept over the cabin, the barn, the surrounding woods, missing nothing. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the damp air, sharp and demanding. "Winston Hall, we know she's here. Open up, or we will." Winston didn't move. He stayed at the window, his face a mask, his mind working furiously. How did they find me so fast? The crushed chip, it must have transmitted its last location before failing. Or perhaps they'd triangulated the signal. It didn't matter now. They were here. He took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain calm, level, as he walked to the front door and opened it just a crack, the chain still on. He kept his body slightly behind the solid wood. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Winston asked, his tone neutral, even slightly weary, feigning ignorance. "It's late, and private property." The ringleader stepped forward, his pale eyes fixing on Winston. "Cut the act, Hall. We're not here for small talk. We're here for our property, the Lioness. She belongs to us. Now you're going to let us search the premises, peacefully, or things get unpleasant." Winston kept his expression carefully blank. "Lioness. I haven't seen any lioness around here. Just deer, cougars, the usual. You're mistaken. This is deep wilderness, but it's Washington, not Africa." He started to close the door. "Don't," the ringleader barked, his hand tightening on his rifle. "We have a tracker. She's here on your land. We've been tracking her blood for miles. Saw your ATV out front, covered in mud and what looks like lion hair." His eyes flicked to the barn. "We'll search, now." As he spoke, one of the men near the SUVs gestured towards Winston's ATV, parked near the barn door. "Boss, look. Fresh blood on the rack, and this mud, it matches the trail we followed from the forest." The ringleader's lips curled into a cold smile. "See? No more games, Hall." Winston saw the man's eyes shift towards the power line running from the pole near the road to his cabin. With a nod, 2 of the hunters moved swiftly. Winston heard the sharp crack of the line being cut, followed instantly by the plunge of his cabin into darkness. The lights of the SUVs were the only illumination now, casting long, menacing shadows. Simultaneously, another hunter moved to the corner of the cabin where Winston's old satellite phone was mounted. There was a sharp snick and the phone went dead. Winston's last link to the outside world was severed. The ringleader stepped forward, his face inches from the door. "No power, no phone, no help coming. Now open the door, Hall, or we'll take it down." Winston looked at the cold eyes, at the high-powered rifles, at the men who clearly weren't afraid to use them. He was trapped, but he wasn't cornered, not yet. He knew these woods better than they could ever imagine. This was his home, his battlefield. He took a slow breath, his mind already mapping escape routes, hiding places, the terrain. The dance was beginning, and the forest, he knew, held more dangers than just men. The ringleader's ultimatum hung in the damp air. Open the door. Winston's hand tightened on the solid wood of the doorframe. His eyes, sharp and calculating, darted from the arrogant face of the leader to the men flanking him, their rifles held low but ready. They were confident. Arrogant, used to intimidating men like him. They didn't know these woods. They didn't know him. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering the mud near the SUVs, then quickly turning into a steady, soaking downpour. The forest groaned under the weight of the water, the mist thickening into a near-impenetrable curtain. Perfect. Fine, Winston said, his voice flat, almost bored. He released the chain and swung the door open just wide enough to step out, his hands held slightly away from his body, showing he wasn't armed. The ringleader's eyes narrowed, suspicious, but he gestured for his men to lower their rifles slightly. Search all you want, but it's wet and dark, and like I said, there's no Lioness. As Winston stepped onto the porch, he subtly shifted his weight, his boot catching the edge of a loose floorboard he'd never fixed. It tilted with a loud crack. It was the distraction he needed. Moving with the silent grace of the forest creatures he'd studied for decades, Winston flowed backwards into the cabin, not forwards. In one smooth motion, he snatched his heavy walking stick from its hook near the door and slammed the solid wood door shut, throwing the heavy bolt across it with a resounding thunk. "Hey," the ringleader roared, stepping forward to pound on the door. "What the hell?" But Winston wasn't there. He was already moving through the dark cabin, the layout imprinted in his mind. He bypassed the main window, knowing it would be covered by the SUV's headlights. Instead, he went to the back of the cabin, to a heavy curtain covering what looked like a solid wall. Behind it was a low, narrow opening, a crawl space he'd built years ago for storage, accessible only from inside. It led to a small, camouflaged exit beneath a thicket of rhododendron bushes at the rear of the property, well away from the clearing. He dropped to his knees, wriggling into the tight space, the damp earth smell strong. Seconds later, he was outside, crouched in the pouring rain, the dense foliage hiding him from the view of the men now gathered around the front door, shouting and demanding he open up. They were focused on the cabin, on forcing entry. They hadn't even noticed he was gone. Winston melted into the trees. The rain was his ally, masking sound, the darkness, and missed his cloak. He moved with silent purpose, sticking to the deepest shadows, using the natural cover of massive tree trunks and thick undergrowth. He knew every root, every depression, every animal trail. He knew where the ground was soft and muddy, where it was rocky and firm. He knew they would try to surround the cabin, cutting off any escape. He needed to get behind them. He moved like a ghost, circling wide. He heard their shouts, the crunch of boots on wet leaves as they fanned out. Two men were moving along the path towards the barn, their flashlights cutting beams through the rain. Winston ducked low, moving parallel to them, staying downwind. He reached a cluster of fallen logs, moss-covered and ancient. He knew one of them was rotten, hollow inside. He scooped up a handful of wet mud and flung it silently onto a low-hanging branch above the path. It landed with a soft plop. As the first hunter passed beneath it, the mud dripped down, landing with a cold splat on his neck. The man swore, jerking his head, momentarily distracted, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. Winston moved. He stepped onto the path behind the second hunter, who was a few paces ahead. With lightning speed, Winston raised his walking stick and brought it down hard on the man's wrist holding the rifle. There was a sharp crack, a cry of pain, and the rifle clattered to the ground, muffled by the wet leaves. Winston silenced the man with a swift, precise blow to the solar plexus, dropping him gasping into the undergrowth. He snatched the rifle, ejected the magazine, and tossed the weapon deep into the bushes. The first hunter, hearing the commotion, spun around, his flashlight beam finding Winston. "Hey, you!" He raised his own rifle. Winston didn't hesitate. He threw himself sideways, rolling into the dense ferns as the hunter fired. The shot echoed through the woods, loud and sharp, followed by the thwack of a bullet hitting a tree trunk. Winston came up behind the shooter, his stick raised. A swift, controlled strike to the back of the knee buckled the man's leg. As he stumbled, Winston relieved him of his rifle, repeating the process, magazine out, weapon discarded. Both men were disarmed, groaning but alive, hidden in the foliage where they wouldn't be immediately found. Winston melted back into the shadows, the rain washing away any traces. He was a shadow, and the hunters were now blind in the dark. Deep in the trees, away from the immediate vicinity of the cabin, the remaining hunters pushed further into the woods, following the ringleader's furious commands. They were angry, frustrated, and now, after the shots, wary of an unseen enemy. They moved in a tighter group, flashlights probing the dripping darkness. The ringleader was in the lead, his face a mask of cold rage. Winston, hidden high in the crook of an ancient cedar, watched them pass below. He knew this part of the forest intimately. It was old growth, dense but with a network of game trails, and it was prime grizzly territory. The massive, solitary bear that ruled these woods was notoriously territorial and aggressive, especially in the fall when food was scarce and it was preparing for hibernation. Winston had seen its massive tracks, heard its deep grunts echoing in the valleys. He'd always given it a wide berth. He watched as the hunters, 8 men now, moved cautiously but confidently through a particularly dense thicket of young firs. They were close to a small, boggy clearing that Winston knew the bear frequented, especially when raindrops drove insects down, making them easy prey. Suddenly, the forest went utterly still. Even the rain seemed to hush for a moment. The hunters stopped, sensing it too. A low, deep, guttural growl vibrated through the air, so low it was felt more than heard. It came from the dense undergrowth just ahead on the edge of the bog. "What was that?" one of the men whispered, his voice tight. "Probably just the wind," the ringleader said, but his own voice lacked its usual conviction. He raised his rifle, scanning the shadows. Then the earth seemed to move. A massive dark shape erupted from the thick ferns with terrifying speed and power. It was a wall of fur and muscle, easily over 800 pounds, a grizzly bear, its small eyes blazing with territorial fury. Its lips were curled back, revealing rows of yellow, dagger-like teeth. A deep, earth-shaking roar tore from its throat, freezing the blood in every hunter's veins. Chaos erupted. "Bear!" one man screamed, pure terror in his voice. Shots rang out in rapid succession, muzzle flashes blinding in the gloom. Bang, bang, bang. But the bear, enraged by the noise and lights, didn't flinch. It moved with terrifying agility. One swipe of its massive paw, claws like ivory scimitars, sent a hunter flying backwards, screaming, blood spraying through the rain. Another man was bowled over as the bear charged through the group, its momentum unstoppable. Snaps, crunches, and the wet, tearing sounds of flesh and fabric were horrifyingly clear. Men screamed, cursed, fired wildly, their discipline shattered by primal terror. The ringleader fired his rifle point-blank into the bear's flank, but the beast barely slowed, turning its attention to him with a low, menacing rumble. Winston, watching from his perch, felt a cold certainty wash over him, even amidst the horror. The 3 scarzell, the deep, vertical claw marks on the lioness's flank. This was the monster that had inflicted them. She had escaped this beast, fleeing through pain and terror, only to run into the arms of men just as ruthless. And now, the hunters, chasing her trail, had marched straight into the heart of the very territory they should have feared most. They hadn't been the apex predators here. Not even close. Through the rain and the screams, Winston saw the ringleader break from the melee. He dropped his rifle, perhaps jammed or empty, and was running, pure panic overriding everything else. He wasn't heading back towards the SUVs. He was bolting blindly, driven by terror, straight towards Winston's barn, the only solid structure he could see through the trees. The bear, momentarily distracted by other prey, didn't immediately follow. The ringleader stumbled, fell, scrambled up, and sprinted the last 50 yards across the open ground towards the barn door, which stood slightly ajar. Winston had left it that way for the lioness's sake, to allow airflow. The man burst through the doorway, slamming it shut behind him, leaning against it, gasping for breath, his face ashen. He was desperate, cornered, and still armed. He had a pistol drawn. His eyes darted around the dim interior, illuminated only by the ambient light from the storm and the distant, horrifying sounds of the bear finishing its grim work in the woods. Then he saw what he'd come for. In the far corner, on the thick bed of straw, lay the lioness. She was up, alert, her body tense, her golden eyes fixed on the intruder. Her cubs were hidden beneath her powerful body, safe for now. The lioness let out a low, warning growl, the sound vibrating in the confined space. The ringleader's eyes lit with predatory hunger, overriding his fear. The prize, the cubs, smaller, easier to handle, more valuable. He couldn't take the adult, but the cubs he could still cut his losses, still make a fortune. "Easy, girl," he rasped, raising his pistol, his voice trembling but his intent clear. "Just need the cubs. Won't hurt you. Just need the cubs." He took a step forward, then another, his eyes fixed on the squirming shapes beneath the lioness. Winston burst through the barn door. He'd seen the ringleader enter and knew he had to act. "Get away from her," he yelled, his voice raw with anger. The ringleader spun, his pistol swinging towards Winston. "You, Hall, you brought this down on us." His eyes were wide, unfocused, filled with rage and the dawning realization of his predicament. He raised the pistol, aiming directly at Winston's chest. Should have just let her die. Winston froze, his walking stick held loosely, useless against a bullet at this range. The ringleader's finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Winston saw the man's knuckles whiten on the grip, saw the cold certainty in his eyes. He saw the lioness, coiled like a spring, her muscles bunching beneath her golden fur, her eyes fixed not on Winston, but on the threat facing her cubs. As the hammer clicked back, the lioness moved. It wasn't a roar. It was a sound from the depths of the earth, a primal scream of pure, protective fury. She exploded from the shadows, a streak of gold and muscle. She crossed the distance in a single, powerful bound, her body a blur. Her massive paw, claws fully extended, swept out not at Winston but at the ringleader. It connected with the force of a sledgehammer, knocking the pistol from his hand and sending it skittering across the straw. Before the man could even register the loss, the lioness was on him. She pinned him to the ground, her powerful forelegs pressing his chest, her weight immobilizing him. Her muzzle was inches from his face, her breath hot, her eyes blazing with an ancient, terrifying fire. A low, continuous growl rumbled in her chest, vibrating the very floorboards. The ringleader screamed, a high-pitched sound of abject terror, scrabbling uselessly at the straw. The lioness held him there, a queen holding court over a vanquished foe, her gaze never leaving his, making it abundantly clear that his reign, his arrogance, his cruelty was over. Winston stood frozen for a heartbeat, the adrenaline crashing through him. Then, the sound of multiple sirens cut through the storm, growing rapidly louder. Red and blue lights began to pulse through the rain-lashed windows, washing the barn in an eerie, shifting glow. The police had arrived. By dawn, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle. The mist still clung to the trees, but the oppressive darkness had lifted. Police cars and a wildlife ranger's truck were parked haphazardly near the cabin. The surviving hunters, those who had escaped the grizzly's wrath or Winston's disarming, were being loaded into the back of cruisers, their faces grim, their arrogance shattered. The scene in the woods was being processed, the grim evidence of the bear's attack cordoned off. Winston stood in the doorway of the barn, leaning against the frame. He was exhausted, his clothes torn and muddy, but a profound sense of peace, of rightness, settled over him. Inside the barn, in a patch of warm straw illuminated by the weak morning light filtering through the door, the lioness lay. She was cleaner now, the deep claw marks on her flank dressed with fresh bandages. She was nursing her two healthy cubs, their tiny bodies squirming contentedly against her. She looked up as Winston entered, her golden eyes meeting his. There was no fear, no aggression, only a deep, calm understanding. She gave a soft, rumbling purr, a sound of contentment and trust. Winston knelt beside her slowly, carefully extending a hand. She sniffed his fingers, then gently bumped her massive head against his palm, a gesture of acceptance, of kinship. He looked at her, the queen who had fought her way through pain and terror, who had defended her young, who had defended him. He looked at the cubs, the future. The lonely woods he'd retreated to, the sanctuary he'd built for himself, was no longer just his. It had become something else entirely. It had become a true sanctuary, not just for him, but for her, for them, for the wild, beautiful, and sometimes dangerous creatures that needed a safe place. He hadn't just saved a life. He'd found a new purpose. He wasn't just Winston Hall, the solitary wildlife rehabilitator, anymore. He was a guardian, a protector, and his family, his very different, furry family, was safe. Finally,